Thank you very much for inviting me here, and I'm very happy to have the chance to share this work with you and talk to you about the beginning of what we hope will be a long-term project to look at what Josep explained is a very understudied population, but important for what's going to happen with the future of deaf children's lives. But I need to start by pointing out that the project that I'm reporting to you right now is actually led by my colleague Deborah Chen Pickler at Gallaudet University. She started the idea to focus on the parents. For a long time, she and I have been collaborating on studies that look at the way deaf children learn a sign language, and even the way that hearing children learn a sign language. But she became interested in knowing more about how adults learn as a second language, and especially in the context of adults who are the parents of deaf children. In those contexts, when they decide it's a good idea for them to learn to sign and to have their child learn a sign language, how do the parents learn? We're hoping that what I'm talking about now is eventually going to be a long and in detail study of both how the parents learn and how their children learn and what relationship there is between them. But right now we don't have data on all of that. Right now what we have is the beginning exploration of this question by talking to the parents and finding out about their attitudes and experiences. So that's what the project is going to be about. As usual, I always like to give thanks to the families and the educators who are involved with the project that we do. And I need to acknowledge that the illustrations that are on the slides come from the LeadK website. Okay, so now, introduction. What is this project about? We know that sometimes hearing parents of deaf children decide that they want to learn a sign language. They want their child to have exposure to a sign language and learn it together as a family language. The way that hearing parents of deaf children learn a sign language, the way they approach this task is quite different from what happens for a typical second language learner of a sign language in, say, a college situation. They're not the same kind of context. They don't have the same kind of motivation. So we should think about the way that parents are learning differently from the way we think about the way other adult learners learn a sign language. They need to have survival skills to talk with an infant. And as the child develops, they need to be able to keep up, or at least they need to be able to talk about more and more advanced topics. And in many cases, the hearing parents are learning the sign language at their child's school. So in many cases, they're learning whatever their school, the child's school, has determined can be an appropriate program for the parents. But this is often rather limited as well. So we think that if we understand better the approach and the journey that the hearing parents have taken, we will be able to have better decisions about programs for the hearing parents to teach them about sign languages and to encourage them to use it as one of their family's languages. We know that it's possible that if the parents are learning to sign and communicate well with their children, then their children might have better language development, social emotional development, cognitive development overall. Or that is to say, we hope that, we expect that, but there's no evidence in literature, there's no recording or research about these possible relationships when the parents are exposed to a true full sign language. So we want to understand better this situation so that we can eventually have such a detailed research study in order to present evidence to families when they want to know what will happen, what will the consequences be for my child if I make this decision. So how are the hearing parents of deaf children unique? In the US, fewer than 5% of deaf children are born to deaf parents. Maybe the number is similar here, I'm not sure, but it's probably a very common number that the vast majority of deaf children are born to hearing parents who don't know anything about deafness and don't know anything about sign language. And when the parents start to get some information about what to do, well, they may be told, don't sign, right? We know that oftentimes hearing parents are told not to sign if they want the children to develop spoken language. And especially if they're going to be using a cochlear implant, which the doctors very often stress that they need to have a full access to spoken language only. But that means that the children are necessarily going to have a period with language deprivation. They're going to go through at least some period of time where they don't get access to any language. So if the parents want to have no gap in time when their children has a missing exposure to language, then they might decide to use a sign language even though they've been encouraged not to. Here's a little picture about how the history of the use of sign language has developed in the United States, perhaps in other places as well. So in the 1970s or so, it was commonly the case that deaf children would go to a special deaf school, and they might very well have exposure to signed English or natural sign language, ASL, but very rarely did their parents learn very much sign language. They almost always had very, very limited communication at home. In the 90s, it began to change somewhat, and there was some improvement in terms of the parents starting to learn sign language. But even at that time, maybe 50% of the time, children couldn't have a communication with their parents in sign language. Nowadays, we don't have any hard data. There is not a solid survey of what's happening. But we do know that many parents are encouraged not to sign, and if they do have some experience with sign language, it's likely to be a mixture of simultaneous communication or signed English and perhaps some ASL. But a lot of parents are not, even if they do want to have some sign language, they may not have experience with the natural sign language ASL. There's a little bit of research to hint that the early exposure to a sign language is actually not only going to not hurt, but would actually help the children, even if the parents decide that they should have a cochlear implant or hearing technology and develop a spoken language. So in a previous study that our group conducted, we studied the development of both speech and sign by deaf children who had cochlear implants, but the children were also born to families who had deaf parents and were already using sign language. So the sign language, ASL, natural sign language, was their first language. The children were exposed to ASL from birth. And then they received a cochlear implant sometime between the age of 1 and 3. And then we tested them to see what both of their languages looked like when they were 5 years old. And what we found is that the children were developing ASL in the same pattern as you would see for other deaf children with deaf parents. But their spoken language was also on target. Their spoken language was also developing very well. And in their performance for both the sign language and their spoken language, they actually performed very much like CODA children, hearing children with deaf parents. So by the time the children are 5 or 6, their sign language is continuing to develop fine, but their spoken language is also developing, and they have both languages. So for hearing parents, if they want their deaf children to learn a spoken language, which many hearing parents want, if we can say they can do that and also learn a sign language, that might be a good way for them to achieve what they want and also achieve what's best for their child. But those children that we studied, because their parents already knew a sign language, they had a great advantage. Their parents were already signing from the time the children were born. And so they had native input from birth. What happens when the children are born with parents who don't know a sign language? And it may take some time before the parents can learn to sign fluently, if they can at all. Is that if the parents are signing some, is it better than nothing? There is some evidence that's not so encouraging, but it's not very thorough evidence yet. There's some reviews in the literature that indicate that the parents who are learning a sign language are not necessarily going to learn fast enough, and the children will still have significant delays in their language development. So, for example, the work by Mayer and Lay. Another study that was more focused looked at the way that the parents developed their use of the sign language phonology, whether they were pronouncing the signs correctly, and looked at how that compares to the children's development of the correct phonological pronunciation of signs. And they found that the adults who were learning BSL were not accurate in their hand shape or in their sign phonology frequently. They were still making many errors, and their children made more errors than the children who were born to deaf signing parents. So these studies make us concerned a little bit. Can the parents learn fast enough? What's the context for their learning? So our proposal, our hope, is to have a program that encourages and promotes the parents to learn to sign very well, but also makes sure that the children are exposed to sign language from skilled signers. If the children are only exposed to their parents who are just weak signers, that might not be enough. But if their parents do learn something and they are able to communicate with the child, and the child has exposure to fluent signers, that may be the kind of program that would be best for the children. That's what we're hoping to find. Let's compare hearing parents as L2 sign learners to typical L2 sign learners who are, let's suppose, mostly college students. So the typical L2 sign learners are learning because they're curious, they're interested. They think it will be useful for them, sometimes because they want to get a job working with deaf people. And they tend to learn in a classroom with other adults. They're taught how to talk to adults. And their teachers can choose from different curricula that are possible for teaching American Sign Language and probably other sign languages as well. And there is a small but growing literature looking at the kinds of steps that these learners will take. But the hearing parents need to communicate with their child. They typically learn at home or at the child's school, so they're only learning about how to talk to other children. And they often don't learn a lot about how to talk to adults. They do have some resources, some programs for children on TV or on the web, for example, but there's not a good standardized or common curriculum that they can use in their learning. And nobody's studied them as a group of learners. What there have been to date are a few kinds of studies about hearing parents in different contexts. So I mentioned already the study that looked at the parents in learning BSL. This is a study by Liu and colleagues. And this is the one that looked at the way they form the signs and how that influences their development. And there are very few studies that look at the hearing learners in this kind of analytical way. There are a few studies that have surveys of the parents' experiences to ask them about their reasons for making the choices they did and things like this. And there are a few qualitative reports about the interventions where a researcher will give a general impression, but without any numerical support. These kinds of studies, there are very few, and they haven't gone into a lot of detail about the parents' development. So, as I said before, our first step is to investigate the attitudes and the experiences of the parents. We haven't measured their output yet either, but we hope to be able to do that in the future. So what we have done is to have interviews with families, with hearing parents of deaf children. And we are specifically conducting these interviews with parents who have made the decision that they want their child to be exposed to ASL and they want to learn ASL themselves. And as I'll show you momentarily, for some of the parents, they've been working at it for a while and some of them are relatively new. And we asked them about why they made this decision and what was difficult for them or what were their experiences like. So this is a complex chart, but it just is a summary of 10 families, the first 10 families that have taken part in the interviews. We have a few more now, but this is the 10 that I will report on today. So the child's age at the time we interviewed their parents ranged from 1 year to 6 years. And some of the children had a cochlear implant or they were expecting to get a cochlear implant, and the others were using hearing aids of different kinds. And in some cases, we interviewed just the mother. In some cases, we interviewed the mother and the father. And in one case, we interviewed a group that included the mother and the grandmother and a family friend who were all sharing in raising the child. These are the questions, the main research questions that we asked. We had long discussions, and we let their responses guide us to what we followed up with. But the main questions that we were trying to answer are given here. First, what made the parents decide to choose ASL, even if they had pressure not to? And what were their goals for themselves and for their children? What parts of ASL did they find difficult to learn or easier to learn? And what methods did they think were the most effective for them to learn ASL? And lastly, what do they still need in order to continue to develop the use of ASL? And every family, of course, was different. Every family has a different story to tell. But there were some things that we saw that came out over and over again, which are summarized here. So the first one is that the families in general viewed ASL as a logical choice. They understood that they needed to communicate with their child, and that even if the child was starting to learn speech or to use a cochlear implant, it wasn't going to be the thing that they would use all the time. And they needed to have ASL as well. So those parents understood the practicality of learning ASL as well. Interestingly, the parents all had different experiences, but most of the ones that we talked to had some previous understanding about either ASL or about multilingualism with other languages. In the United States, actually, many families have no experience with having more than one language. It's very common for families to have only one language and to resist having bilingualism. But these families already knew something about having bilingualism and about why it's a good thing to have more than one language. That probably helps. These families valued the possibility of being able to communicate with their children as they developed. They wanted to have a good relationship with their children that involves talking to each other about daily life. And there was some variability in terms of their acceptance of reality, because some of the parents, especially those whose children were older, were aware that their signing wasn't the best and that it was hard for them to learn to be as good as their children because their children were already better signers than them. Some of the parents were a little bit less aware of this and thought that they were signing really well, but they might find out later on that they still had a ways to go. Some of them very well could have been underestimating their own ability. Some of them were pretty good signers and thought that they were not good enough. So this varied quite a bit. I'm going to give you a snapshot of a few of the children, not all of them. I'll skip over some of them. But I want to give you some information that came from the interviews to give you a feeling for what these children were like. So for example, I'm going to start with this one, Hannah. Hannah is a 1-year-old child, the youngest of 4. She was using a hearing aid and scheduled for a cochlear implant, and the mother was interviewed. And the mother said, I know that the technology will break, and I want to be able to communicate even when there's no battery or it's not possible to use the hearing technology. In terms of awareness, this mother had an aunt who was an ASL interpreter. So she was already familiar with the use of sign languages. And she was also aware that she probably wouldn't sign as well as her child at some point, but she wanted to do the best that she could do. Here's a slightly older child, 2.5 years old. This child had a somewhat late diagnosis at 18 months. The mother was not sure she wanted to get a cochlear implant for the child, but that he was using hearing aids. The mother was also very strong-willed herself. She said, I'm going to do what I think is best. I don't care what other people think. So she was aware of the pressures not to sign, but she rejected that. But her mother was deaf, oral deaf, and so she had awareness about deafness, and the mother started to learn sign language in order to communicate with the grandchild. This is the child for whom the family group was interviewed. And this was a family who uses Spanish at home. They, therefore, again, understood about multilingualism, and they understood about what it takes to learn another language. Because they were Spanish speakers at home, but they were also English speakers. They had also learned to speak English and use English in the community. So they understood about multilingualism, and they understood about the value of learning sign language for their child. And their goal was that their daughter should become multilingual and use ASL and spoken English and spoken Spanish, because those were the family languages. And they were expecting that the child would be able to learn all three. Okay, each family has a different set of stories, but I'm just trying to give you some of the picture here. So let's go back to those 5 questions that I set out as the research questions and see how each of them is answered by the interviews with the parents. So first of all, what made the parents decide to choose ASL? Most of them had the goal of communicating with their child, and they thought that using ASL would be the most effective way to succeed with communicating with their children. They wanted to open up as many possibilities as they could. They didn't want to have one option only and then have that one not to work. They thought it made sense. They understood the rationale for having ASL. And in some cases, the family understood that for the child, ASL would be important for them to connect with other deaf people. So many of the, not many, but some of the parents already understood that their child would belong to the deaf community and would want to have ASL for that reason. So they wanted to be able to communicate with their child themselves, but they also wanted their child to be able to use this language and be included. They had also encountered some of the reports that are very common in the US, which argue that it's good for children to use baby signs. So ironically, in the US, a lot of children are exposed, hearing children are exposed to baby signs, but deaf children are told not to sign. But if the parents understand that baby signing can be a good thing to do with hearing children, then why not sign with deaf children as well? So what are their goals for learning ASL? For some of the parents, they wanted their child to have full exposure to ASL, but their own goal was to learn enough to be able to communicate to support the speech. So a number of the parents, even though they wanted to have ASL, they didn't necessarily want to have ASL and not use speech. They wanted to be able to use speech with their children, but to use ASL so that they could succeed with communicating. Others wanted to become truly bilingual. They really wanted to have both languages be part of their family. And also, in some cases, the parents or the mothers who we interviewed specifically mentioned that they wanted other members of the family to learn ASL as well. So when we were talking with them, we were mostly talking about their own development in ASL. But some of the families did talk to us about how other children in the family were learning to sign, or other members of the extended family were also learning to sign. So some of them had that broader explicit goal as well. And then, as I mentioned before, some of the parents mentioned also this idea that it's important for the child because of their own deaf identity. Okay, this is to tell you how the parents responded when we asked them which parts of ASL were the hardest or the most intuitive, the easiest to learn. Now let me explain how this chart works. When the parent indicated that they thought, for example, that vocabulary was very easy, 1.5 indicated that they thought vocabulary was very easy. But 5 people said vocabulary was quite difficult. So the more orange on the chart is telling you the more people gave that response. So people thought that classifiers were hard, and they thought that word order was hard, and they thought that storytelling was hard. Those are some of the things that they thought was hard to learn. Things that they thought were more easy to learn, well, it wasn't the case that anything was considered easy by a lot of people, but there were more responses that it wasn't so hard for child-directed signing, that is, knowing how to sign in the special way for their child, and knowing how to make sure your child is attending and looking at you before you sign. This is something that I think that the schools sometimes stress, that the parents have to remember that they have to wait for the child to look at them in order to go on with signing. Here we asked how important each part of each aspect here is for them to learn. So the previous one was how hard it was, but this one is how important do they think it is? Well, what you can see is that for the most part, they thought everything was important, with some being a little bit less, like word order being split here, and even classifiers being split. So they thought it was all important, but some things they thought they could do without. If we look at just the split between more difficult or less difficult and more important or less important, we get the following spread, where the things in the box are critical, really important, but also really difficult from the parent's point of view. So this includes fingerspelling and storytelling and classifiers. These are things that they think they need to know more, but they're finding it hard to learn them. What methods did they think were the most effective? Well, some of them had the experience of one-on-one contact with a deaf mentor. So in some cases, there would be a deaf person who would come to the house and interact with the family and help them to learn ASL. And those who had that thought that this was a very useful way of learning. They also said it was very important to have, to be corrected. So to get the feedback from the deaf mentor about what they were doing right and wrong. They took classes. As I said, they were almost all taking classes at their child's school. Some of them went on and took more classes, for example, at the university, but they start by taking classes at their child's school. They looked for online materials, and they found that this was also very useful for the siblings because there are a lot of programs that are directed at children. And they mentioned the deaf community as well, but they were variable in how much they were involved with the deaf community. Some were more involved than others. And as I said, only some took classes at the local college or university. All in all, though, some of the words of wisdom that they gave for other parents are, you need patience and keep trying. Just keep doing, keep working at it. What do they still need? Well, even if they had some contact one-on-one with deaf mentors, they needed more contact with deaf signers. They thought it was important for them to have more interactions with deaf signers. And they wanted to be able to have a combination of meetings that were done in person and ones that are done online, like with Skype. So some of the families had the possibility of using online meetings, and they thought that would be helpful for them. They did want to have more early education classes at their schools and also more advanced classes. And they were also faced with a particular problem that has to do with the way education programs are run in the US. Might be different here, I don't know. But the way that the programs are run, typically there's one kind of program for families when their child is between 0 and 3, birth to 3. And after the child turns 3, then they have to go into a new program. They're required to shift into a new program, which usually lasts until the child is around 5. Because when they're around 5, then they can start going to the kindergarten classes at the school. So from the time the child is born until the time the child is 5 something, the families have to deal with 3 different kinds of services. And this can be very different options that are available for them, or very different kinds of classes. So it's very difficult for the parents because they have to adjust to new things rapidly throughout this time period. So they were very frustrated about this. And they were frustrated about the need that they had to learn more. They wanted to have more opportunities to learn. They wanted to have more support and more guidance. And as I mentioned, because of the way that the programs are set up, when the child goes into school at 5, then usually there's a lot more resources for the child and very, very few resources for the parents. So the parents need something when the child turns 5. So some of the parents were especially worried about those things. What are they going to do after the child turns 5? So the interviews that we did with parents came from people who were affiliated with several different schools in the US and, well, in North America. And we also, besides talking to the parents, we also wanted to find out more about what the schools themselves are doing. So just to clarify, the parents that we interviewed were involved with schools that were explicitly promoting the use of ASL. So in the US, some schools, some deaf schools, are specifically promoting the use of ASL as well as English. These are bilingual kinds of schools. And other schools are, maybe most schools are still using something like total communication, which means they don't really encourage the families to learn a lot of sign. Or they're oral, in which case they say no sign is allowed at all. So there are only a few schools that are very explicitly bilingual, and those are the ones that we tapped for parents to interview. But we also went to several different bilingual schools to ask about their approaches and how they handle things. We wanted to learn more about what's happening now. So we asked the deaf schools staff and the ASL specialists what programs they have for hearing people. We did interview some of them. So some of the information is just from general inquiry. Some of it is from interviews with the intervention specialists and the ASL teachers. And what we found is that even though we were focusing on the schools that adopt a bilingual approach, there's a lot of variability in what they do and how they do it. There's not a standard approach by any means. And usually what they do is they will have some combination or some variability between having home visits, which might be by a deaf mentor, or it might be by a hearing teacher of the deaf, or it might be both in some cases. And they have what's called early intervention play groups in many cases, or parent sign language classes at the schools. I should have clarified this earlier, we're focusing here on the preschool area, the 0 to 5 age range roughly. And when we asked them about what curricula they use to teach the parents, they all gave us the response that, well, we use a little bit of this and we use a little bit of that. This is helpful, but has some things, but it's really not directed towards parents. And so they really had to make up their own courses for the families because there wasn't any curriculum that was really satisfactory for them. And they also talked about how they have to spend a fair amount of time not only teaching the family about, teaching them how to sign or teaching them about ASL, but they have to do a lot of things like telling them about policies or telling them about other people who might provide support for them in different ways. And in fact, they have to spend a fair amount of time helping the parents to understand more about deafness and what it means to have a deaf child in their family. The way they describe this is that a lot of the hearing families are going through a grieving process because they didn't know anything about deafness ahead of time. And the school people, early intervention providers, have to help them understand it's going to be okay. They have to help them get through that. And then they can focus on language. And some of the families who are supported by these services have other needs. They have other social service needs. Some of them may have a low income. Some of them may have other job issues, things like that. So the teachers have to build trust with the families, and they need to remind them and tell them things over and over again. So sometimes patience is required on that side as well. It's also important for the ASL teachers to help the families to understand about using signing without English, right? So because these hearing parents are still developing, oftentimes it's hard for them to let go of speech. And so the teachers try to convince them, well, at least try maybe during bath time to use only sign without voice, or during breakfast, or have certain times of the day when you focus on just signing with your child. The ASL instructors said that the parents were pretty good about learning vocabulary early on, but then they didn't keep up as fast as the instructors wanted them to, and that they were having difficulty thinking in ASL. So one of the things that we've been thinking about doing is really trying to push the families to not try to think about translation, but just to drop English completely and try to think visually the whole time. Another thing that the ASL instructors told us is that the parents should become more involved in deaf community activities. The more the parents and the families go to deaf activities, the better their opportunities will be to learn ASL. So we need to have that opportunity. And the parents sometimes are not aware of their own limitations, as I mentioned before. One of the things the ASL instructors mentioned is that the parents sometimes need to correct their children, but it's hard for them to give correction to the children if they're not sure what the correct way to sign something is. So they're not able to use feedback that way. And the ASL instructors also emphasize that the parents need to understand more about how to interact with people in conversation, and especially how to interact with adults. And so, as I mentioned before, the families focus on how to use signing with their deaf children, but they need to also experience signing with deaf adults and have more practice with that. So we asked a few questions to the ASL instructors that are, I think, quite revealing. When we asked, okay, how did you learn ASL? So most of the people who were filling out the forms as ASL instructors or early intervention staff, a lot of them are deaf, and a number of them are people, if they're not deaf, they're very fluent signers. So when they were asked, how did you learn sign? They all said, well, because of interaction with deaf community, with other deaf people. Some of them as children growing up, and some of them later. They all mentioned that, and that's, I'm sure, quite important for the hearing parents as well. So they need more resources. Oops, I skipped that. They need more resources, and they need to become more advanced. Those were other comments that they made. We asked the teachers to fill out the same chart that I showed you before from the parents about what's difficult and what's easy, what's critical and what's not critical. And the pattern is about the same. So in yellow, orange, we have the responses from the parents that I showed you before, and in blue are the responses from the teachers. And it's basically the same pattern, except that the teachers also think that the word order, ASL word order, is important, is critical. So they see things in the same way. They can see that the aspects of ASL grammar that make it the most different from English are typically the parts that are most difficult for the parents to learn. So we think that the teachers probably need to focus on some of the interaction skills, but also very much the need for input to be visual all the time, to keep visual input. And even if it's something that the parents don't know how to sign, that they need to think about how to present information visually, how to convey the information visually. But specifics about ASL grammar, it's a little bit less clear. Even though people thought that it was important, it was also difficult. What's most important, we've heard from other people, is that the parents are communicating with the children. So this has been just a snapshot of a few parents who are interested in the learning of a sign language in order to communicate with their children better, even though they may have had pressure for not using sign language from some people. We don't know how many hearing parents are like that. We don't know how many hearing parents really want to learn ASL. And of course, I think that's the case that many hearing parents don't have information about ASL because it really depends on where their child is born, what kind of information they get. The way that things work in the US, it tends to be very much driven by individual states and sometimes by individual communities within a state. So the experiences that a family has will be very different depending on where they live. We know that the language learning needs for hearing parents are very different from typical L2 learners. And that those needs need to be addressed at the beginning to get them started, to get them able to talk about everyday kinds of things, but they also need to be able to do advancing. They also need to be able to do more complex structures. I'm just going to follow up a little bit on the study that I mentioned before that was done with BSL, because it's one of the few that really addressed this question directly. The parents and the teachers in our survey thought that sign form was not that hard. So it was one of the things that people thought was, not that hard. But this study that was done in the UK found that the parents were not doing, not producing signs correctly much of the time. They were not always producing the form correctly. And when we were doing the interviews with the families, we did the interviews in speech. So we didn't watch them signing for an extended period. But we could see once in a while they would produce a sign, it would come up in context. And our impression was that their signs were not always produced exactly correctly. They're late learners. They have an accent, let's say, right? They don't look like the way that a native signer looks in the forms of their signs. So we're not sure whether it's important for parents to learn how to make the correct form of a sign. That is to say, suppose the parent produces a sign like the sign for wrong in ASL. You could produce it with the pinky really close to the hand or with the pinky farther away. And that's a very subtle difference. If the parents produce it one way and the community produces it a different way, maybe it's not such a big deal because the children will understand. But it's the kind of difference that second language learners sometimes make. To be more, to give another example, if the parent is producing a sign like girl in ASL, but they produce it with a sloppy hand shape or that's not clear or something like this, then maybe it will be far enough from the way that the sign is produced by signers in the community that the child won't learn the right version of the sign or that they will not understand, right? So a question for you, if you have thoughts during the discussion part, do you think it's important for parents to learn how to produce the sign really accurately? Or do you think it's just important enough for them to be able to communicate however they produce their signs? We can have the same kind of question for grammar. Parents did think that producing ASL grammar, such as word order and classifiers, was difficult. But it wasn't so clear whether they thought it was very critical. Some parents are going to use an ASL, more ASL structures, and some are going to use fewer ASL structures, more English-like structures, because they're being exposed to ASL, but they may not have as much development in ASL. So how important is it for them to use real ASL kinds of structures versus using structures that are clearly English influenced, but conceptually right? So if you have thoughts about that, please let me know during the comment session. So just briefly, I want to mention that together with Deb Chen-Pickler and Elaine Gale, we have made a proposal to do a more in-depth study of the parent development of signing that I just have mentioned. And we don't have funding yet, but we're hoping, we're revising our proposal and submitting it again. We're hoping we'll have this. And if we're lucky, then at some point in a few years, I'll be able to come back and tell you more about how the parents are learning, and this time give you more details about their progress and their children's progress. So just to conclude and wrap up, it is important for hearing parents to learn enough sign to be able to communicate with their children quickly, but also we think it's important for them to have a more advanced development in their signing, which is much more difficult for them to do. There's a need for curriculum development. In the US, there's some, but there's really not enough to give parents all that they need. And one point to keep in mind as we do this kind of work is that it's important for us to remember that this is different from many bilingual households. So people who study bilingualism will often tell the family, if your home language is different from the language that's used outside, you should go ahead and use your home language because your child will have enough experience with the outside language that they will be able to develop that language as well. This is the opposite situation where the parents are trying to learn the language that will be their child's language. It's not the dominant language of the community. But we still think that it's important in this context to keep it in mind that it's better for the parents to learn their child's language to prevent cases of language deprivation. And finally, I think the deaf community is really important for this kind of project to succeed. For hearing parents who want to learn to sign, they need contact with the deaf community. They need to be involved in deaf community activities. And even though they don't sign very well, they need people who are willing to interact with them so that their sign development goes better. So the deaf community is really important for this. And I think that in general, the deaf community is very encouraging of it. So we're happy to know that. Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Diane, for this very interesting piece of research. Really encouraging that, work from bilinguists is also tapping into these crucial issues of sign language transmission and sign language acquisition. So thanks again. Now we have the chance to ask questions, make comments about the presentation. Just one warning, try to be short in your questions because of time, but also because of the interpreting situation. So if you have, you can ask questions in English, of course, in Catalan sign language, but if you want to ask a question in Catalan Spanish, take into account that this will be a little bit more complicated, so please be specific and concrete. Another aspect, the lecture is being recorded, so if you don't want to be on the recording, which will be posted on the faculty website, you can, if you're speaking, you just hold your microphone and sit down. And if you're signing, you can either come up and sign here for the audience, or you can sign here outside the frame of the recording. Okay? No, the recording is back there. Okay. So, do you want to take the questions? I mean, there is one microphone for those who want.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. The presentation was very nice. And I would like to raise the debate about the parameters and well, the shape of the signs that the parents sometimes don't do well, that if it's important or not. I think it is important, actually. Many time ago, parents didn't learn sign language or barely learn sign language, and the communication with their children were with their own language. And there was no contact of the family with the children barely. But this is changing. Eventually, was changing, and eventually they started learning sign language. And if the parents were teaching these languages too, then the children that adopt this language as an L1, they don't learn the language from an L1 signer, but from an L2, so they don't learn it wrong, and they can spread this language and these parameters to the society, these wrong signs or this wrong signing, so to understand. So then the language can change. With this situation, do you understand what I mean? For me, it is very important that the parents take care of learning the language and use sign language as the grammar, the word order, and every aspect of sign language good. So it has to be a priority for them. And we don't have to say, okay, just a little bit of communication, more or less, it's okay, and then influence the children. They take this sample from the parents, and I don't think this is good. I would like to raise this debate and to say this comment.
So thank you for your comment, and this is exactly the concern that we have, which is why I brought it up. I raised the question to another audience who stressed the communication aspects, but that surprised me, actually. I thought people would have the reaction that you had, which is that it's important for them to sign as well as possible. But I think that the real solution, the practical solution, is going to have to be that the parents being L2 learners are not the primary or even the ones who provide the most input, but that the most input comes from deaf signers who are fluent signers. So if the family has, if they have opportunities at the school, for example, or in the community, or with a deaf mentor program, or a deaf nanny, even better, that they would have at least a good amount of input from fluent signers, as well as from the parents. I know that as a parent, there's a lot of hours in the day when the child is interacting with the parents, and that's the person who they would get their primary input from. But they do interact with a lot of other people as well, or they could, right? And if the family makes the arrangement, if it's possible to make the arrangement, that they get input from fluent signers a fair amount of the time. And the parents try to learn as well as they can, then maybe that's the most practical solution. I think, yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that. It's the goal, certainly, to have parents sign as well as they can, but it's hard. It takes a long time to learn. It takes a few years at least, right? So meanwhile, hopefully there will be input from others as well.
Other questions?
I actually have a lot of questions. Let me think. One of them would be, you were talking about the importance of the deaf community and the parents to have contact with the deaf community to learn. So the problem that I see is that the deaf community, what is it exactly, the deaf community? I mean, they want there to join, to spend some time and not, I mean, the deaf community is not going to really have the role of teaching sign language to the parents. I don't know, maybe in America and the US it's different. Maybe there are different specialists or maybe different figures or maybe different deaf mentors or there are other professionals. But I think that most of the times in the deaf community, people want to have fun, to have contact with other people and not to have the role of being the teachers of other person or other hearing persons that don't know sign language. So I don't know if the US, this is maybe different. So maybe you can give me some information about that.
Yeah, so you're right. It's not fair to ask deaf people to do this volunteer work of teaching a whole bunch of hearing people how to sign. I totally agree with you that it shouldn't be something that we simply say, please volunteer to spend a lot of hours with these hearing people. That's not what I mean to say. So in some of these schools, the deaf people are employed as teachers, right? So they work at the school. It's their job to be teachers for the hearing parents, right? So that's one of the ways that this works, whether they're doing it in a classroom or by home visits. So I suspect that having home visits by a paid deaf mentor is probably going to be very useful for the families, right? So certainly the school and the deaf people who are employed at the school, the ASL specialists, the schools tend to have, the bilingual schools at least, they tend to have people who are trained as ASL teachers. They're ASL specialists, and that's their training and that's their work. So they have a primary responsibility, right? But I think that it's also probably going to be necessary for the families to be able to go to events. For example, there might be a storytelling for children at the library that's in sign language, and a lot of deaf people would go to that, and then the hearing families should attend that as well and have that kind of an informal interaction, right? Those are the kinds of events that I think that are reasonable to ask people to go to and to be able to interact with deaf people in that context. So those kinds of things I think will be useful for the families. But it's important to recognize both that the deaf community, if they go to a club, if they have an event, the deaf people want to interact with each other and their friends, and they don't want to spend a lot of time being taking care of the hearing family who wants to participate. But for the sake of the deaf children in those hearing families, some kind of a connection is probably going to be necessary so that the child gets exposed to fluent signers who are in the community that they are joining. So I'm sure that it needs to be done very carefully and with a great awareness of not asking individual people to do things that they're not willing to do, but to have the right kinds of roles set up so that kids get the input they need. So, thank you.
Talking about the chart that we saw before, about the parents and the teachers, how the parents felt that the classifier and the word order was difficult to learn, and also the teachers were agreeing with that, the specialists were agreeing with that. I think classifiers are very important, but as you see, the word order was not that important in this, according to this chart. But I would like to know how the parents and these specialists are learning these languages and as an L2, but I would like to know how are they learning the language, because maybe the methodology that the teachers, the deaf teachers are using is more like a bilingual methodology, translating between English and sign language and ASL and giving information in this kind of way. And then this maybe can have consequences in the way they feel these difficulties in the word order. Because if they are dependent on the spoken language, on English in this case, they can feel that it is different. But if the methodology used is like a monolingual methodology, and they are directly signing without forgetting about the English, forgetting about the spoken language, then would they agree with the results that you have in this chart, in this situation?
Yeah.
So how did they learn ASL? Because if they learn ASL with a bilingual methodology, I understand that they feel that these aspects are different. But if they learn it with a monolingual, without the dependency on the spoken language, then I think it would be different. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for the comment and the question. As to those particular families, I can't say for sure what method they were getting. They were different because they were all coming from different places. But I suspect that most of them were having this bilingual method that you were talking about, where they're really thinking, cat, milk, right? Or a very much translation and thinking English dependent. I think it's true that that's the primary method that they get. And I suspect you're right, that having, trying to convince the parents not to think in English is probably the best way for them to learn more about how to think in ASL. The family I mentioned before who speak Spanish at home, they had an interesting point. They said, yeah, we thought it was a little bit hard at first to learn about ASL. But then we thought about how English is different from Spanish. And we realized, oh yeah, so ASL is different also, right? So English is different from Spanish in this way, in word order, for example. And so if we think more like Spanish instead of more like English, or not necessarily exactly like Spanish, but just thinking more metalinguistically and not thinking about it as English, as a way of conveying English, then they learn better. So I think it does help for the parents if they've already got an idea about how you think about a second language as being not just a word-for-word translation of your first language.
Okay, so thank you for your talk. Is there anyone? Very brief question. Is there any study comparing let's say the cognitive development from deaf children with deaf parents and deaf children from hearing parents? Because I was wondering the possible effects or the phonological development related to the general cognitive development.
Yeah. So there are some studies that have done this. So most of the studies that look at cognitive development in deaf children are just taking deaf children as a whole and not paying attention to those who have sign language from an early age. Or they may say which children are exposed to a sign language, but they don't measure it, or they don't tell you anything about the way that they were exposed to a sign language. Usually what it means is that they are in a manual program at school, which doesn't necessarily mean they have much ASL at all. But Matt Hall, who was working with me as a postdoc researcher until just recently, has published now 3 studies that compare cognitive development in deaf children of deaf parents, so they had early exposure to sign language, and deaf children with no sign experience at all, so children mostly who were using cochlear implants, and typical hearing children. And on the several different kinds of measures, what he found was that even though the deaf children who were using cochlear implants performed worse than the typical developing hearing children in areas of cognitive development, the deaf children with deaf parents were equal to the hearing children.
I'm sorry, I don't know the last word.
Okay, so 3 groups: deaf children with deaf parents, native signers, non-signing deaf children, children who don't have any sign language and therefore had delayed language input, and hearing children. And so the deaf children with deaf parents performed equal to the hearing children, but just about on all of the tasks. And the deaf children with delayed language input, the ones who had hearing parents and didn't have sign language, they performed significantly worse than the others on most of the tests. In some tests, they were all equal. They were fine. But if there was a difference, the deaf children who were native signers were fine, but the deaf children who had no sign language were worse. In areas of cognitive development, including executive function, aspects of executive function, and implicit learning.
But the second group, you said that this group had no sign language.
Right.
So it was not the case that deaf children with hearing parents that sign.
We don't know about them yet.
We don't know about it.
That's the crucial group, right? We don't know about them. They haven't been studied.
To see the effect of phonology or when you were
Right.
saying that.
Yeah, it's in the proposal. If we get funded, we'll see. Yeah, thank you. Everybody, cross fingers for us, please.
Okay, so some more questions here? No?
So you talked about storytelling and how it is critical and both critical and essential for parents to learn, and also because they lack of it. So first thing is, I was wondering, what are you referring to when you're talking about storytelling? And then could this affect on the relationship between parents and deaf children, and also deaf children and society in general? Thank you.
Yeah, this might be an effect of the schools, or maybe just a general cultural thing, but I think the families felt that it was very important to be able to read a book with their children, to be able to go through a children's book and tell the story about what's happening in the book. And there are a number of programs for children who are learning sign, for parents and children who are learning sign, that are stressing that aspect, the shared book reading, being able to look at books together. And so I think that most of the parents, when they see a word like storytelling, that's what they're thinking about. They're thinking of being able to read a book and tell the story about what's happening. And you know, whether the book has words or not, but generally parents with children, preschool-age children, feel it's important to be able to tell them the story of these books. I don't think they do storytelling about as much about fables or about family history or about, I don't know, maybe religion or something like this. There are other domains where families might do some storytelling with their children, but I think what they're thinking about mostly is shared book reading. Yeah.
Hi. Yes. So did all these families in your study receive support from the administration to learn sign language? And how is it possible? Because
Right.
here it is very difficult for families to learn sign language and to receive this support from the administration.
Yeah. So, because we recruited through bilingual deaf schools, most of the families that we interviewed are families that are participating in a bilingual program at a deaf school. So, in that case, they have support from their school, from the school system, right, the administration. In that sense, they have support because they can choose that. But they typically, well, as I said, they have different programs for birth to 3, 3 to 5, and then 5 on. And one of the things we found out when we interviewed at different schools was that in some cases, if the parents are planning to send their child to an oral program because they want them to use spoken language with a cochlear implant, if the program that they're planning to send their child to at age 5 is an oral-only program, sometimes those programs will say, we won't accept your child if they go to the sign language program first. So you can only send your child to our program at age 5 if they haven't gone to a signing program before that. So sometimes the parents are forced to choose because of that. But the schools that we are cooperating with don't have that perspective, right? They are signing programs. They have signing in the schools. But if the parents want the child to have an implant and to have speech training, they will do that also. So these particular schools are uncommon bilingual schools that will promote the use of spoken English and cochlear implants as well as signing. So there are some schools in the US that will use a bilingual approach with ASL and with spoken English. So, for example, they may have 2 different classrooms, one of which is speech only and one is with sign, but the children go back and forth between them. Or they may have 2 teachers, things like this. So they're schools that are really trying to push a bilingual approach. And so for those schools, parents can have support to do either one. But there are other schools that don't allow it, that only allow children to have speech and they can't use sign language. So most of the families that we talked to were families who were involved with schools that were promoting a bilingual approach. But one of the families, they were bringing their child to both the bilingual school and to an oral-only school. And the oral school didn't approve, but the family did it anyway. And they continued to go to programs at both schools. But the child was not yet age 5, so I don't know what would happen when the child had to go into a longer day program. I should have made this clear, most of the time the programs for the children before the age of 5 are only a few hours a day or a few days a week. They're not full-time programs. So if a family chooses that they want to go to the signing program, but they also want to go to the oral program, they can do that before the child is 5 because they have a few hours a day here and a few hours a day there. The programs tend to be only a couple of hours a day for kids in school, in preschool until they get to 5. So there are places where you can do that, but it just really depends on the requirements of the schools that they're going to. And the doctors, I think the doctors generally urge the parents not to use sign language, but they can't prevent it, basically. So parents will, if they're strong-minded, if they're stubborn, they will say, I don't care if you say I shouldn't sign, I want to sign anyway. But we selected parents to interview who already made that decision, right? I don't know how many percent, 90% maybe, who didn't make that decision. I don't know who they are, but the ones that we interviewed were the ones who made that decision. Okay.
May I ask a very short question related to this?
Yeah.
Which is, where do these parents get information from? Is there any kind of policy? I mean, is it state related, or
Usually,
is locally organized? Because that, I mean, does it come from doctors or from some other part of the administration?
usually it comes from, it's variable depending on the state, and usually, so in the US, if a child is born in a hospital, they will have the newborn hearing screening. So they will have the hearing test done right away, and so if the child is identified, well, if they don't pass the hearing test at the hospital, then they have to come in for another hearing examination, a more detailed one. And if they don't pass that one, then it depends on the hospital who they get referred to. So they may get referred to audiologists only, or they may get referred to the deaf school, which has a family program for the infants, or they may get referred to a central statewide agency, but it's variable. It's all over the place. It's not standard at all, and it's not uncommon to have parents say, "I didn't know about this," or I just did what the doctor told me," something like that. So it is important for parents to get more information.
It's crucial.
It's crucial.
I mean, for the parents to get to that stage of deciding
Right.
whether or not to
Right.
choose
Right.
sign language.
So in the US, there are still some states that have either a statewide or a school that services a large portion of the state. And in some of those cases that I know of, the school will get information from the hospital. They will get the information about which children have referrals, and then they will reach out and contact the families and say, "We have these options for you." So it just depends on who gets that information and passes it along.
Right, so you were talking about the bilingual education, and do you know how many hours do they devote to sign language, to spoken language, or how many time do they devote to spoken language, how many time do they devote to sign language?
And are there
And,
deaf and hearing children
is
at
that-
the same schools? Yeah. So again, it varies from one school to the next. We visited at least half a dozen, maybe close to 10 different schools. So we visited a number of different schools. And every school is different in the way that they do this. It's really hard to give a uniform answer. Generally what happens is that they have a play group where it's not a formal educational situation, but the family comes with the child. They have a deaf teacher who signs, they have a hearing teacher who is a signer, but will use speech, and the children will go back and forth because they're very young. They will play with different things. There will be a story time in ASL. Sometimes the story time is given by one teacher telling the story in ASL and the other one at the same time telling the same story in English. So there are different approaches. One school, I mentioned having 2 different rooms. One school has this interesting thing where they have one room that's signing only and one room that's for speech only. And the parents have the choice. They say, we want my child to spend 40% of the time in the speech room and 60% in the sign room or something else. The parents get to choose. But during certain times of the day, they open up the door between the 2 rooms and the children go back and forth themselves. And they know that one room is for speech and one room is for sign. And they try to make the rooms kind of equal in terms of how fun they are or how much fun stuff there is in each room. So the kids get to go back and forth and choose which room they want to be in based on the language that they are exposed to in that room. This is 3 and 4-year-olds. These are little kids. And the teachers at that school told us that if they notice that maybe the parents have said, we want our child to be in the speech room most of the time, but the child keeps going over to the sign room, they'll tell the parents, you know, your child is really doing well with sign and wants more sign. And then usually the parents will say, well, okay. So I thought that was a really clever idea to have the children exposed, but let them choose, for at least for certain times of the day, which kind of input they want to have. But that particular kind of approach is not something we saw everywhere. Most of the time, it would be more likely that there would be a hearing teacher and a deaf teacher in the same room, and either one of them doing something and the other one doing other things, or sometimes simultaneously doing the same thing. Those were the things that we saw the most. But again, remember, these are kids up to age 5. They're in what we call, you know, a preschool kind of situation. So it's much more play and it's less teaching. Once they go into kindergarten, real school, it might be different. I'm not sure. Oh, and you asked about the hearing and deaf children. These are, I think all of them were cases where the school was only for deaf children. But if they have a play group, then it's possible for the family to bring siblings. So if the child has a hearing brother or sister, they can go and they can be exposed also during that time period. But primarily, I think all of the ones that I went to are only only have deaf children, so they're not. There is another model, this co-enrollment kind of model where everything is for both deaf and hearing children. But these schools were not like that.
Okay, thank you very, very, very much for this wonderful session, Diane. Let me just remind all of you, I mean, some of you know Diane from the linguistics literature. I mean, it's such a luxury to have one of the most prominent sign language linguists today actually dealing with problems and issues that connect directly to policies for deaf people and deaf signers. So thank you also for having this contribution to our community.
My pleasure.
And also to help us understand what our situation just by comparison, and hopefully trying to improve the situation with all these kinds of issues that we are faced with. So thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
And see you soon some other
Okay,
time.
thank you.